Welcome, my name is Sherry. This is the Irish Records Research class. I am a genealogy reference associate at Midwest Genealogy Center, welcoming you on this St. Patrick's Day. So let's go ahead and get started. There we go. All right. As with anything in genealogy research, we begin at the beginning, which is yourself. We're going to do a lot of research in the country that your immigrant ancestor immigrated to, which for most of us will be the United States. So you're going to start with yourself and work your way backwards until you reach information on that immigrant ancestor. We're going to exhaust every record we can possibly find for each of our our ancestors until we get to that particular person. So for example, let's say you've looked at census records and you've looked at vital records and you've looked at maybe tax lists or land records, and you're still trying to find that elusive town that your ancestor came from. It's really important we find the town or the parish, or even at the very least, the county in Ireland that your Irish ancestor was from, because it's going to make looking for records a whole lot easier, because there's not really a central location for records. So we have to kind of narrow it down so that you're not looking at 50,000 Patrick Kellys all over the island. You're just looking for those few Patrick Kellys in the area where your ancestor came from. So here's an example. This is a passenger list record for an One Fitzmaurice. She was 24 at the time that she sailed to America. She arrived in New York in 1886. So by doing the maths, we guesstimated that she was born around 1862. And then if you look, it's a little blurry as we blow it up a bit, but if you look on the very far right, it tells us what county she was from. So it gives us a hint of where we're going to start looking, and that's County Tipperary. Also notice too that sometimes those ships that carried our ancestors may have made several stops. So she may have boarded at Queenstown, but they may have made a stop at Liverpool before landing in New York. So just be aware that if you see Liverpool as where it came from, that doesn't necessarily mean that was the original place of embarkation. It might have been just the last place the ship docked before they came to New York or Philadelphia or whatever particular port they entered into. Here's another example. This is an advertisement from the Boston Pilot. The Boston Pilot was well known for having a lot of advertisements where immigrants would come looking for their relatives who had already landed here earlier. This one was from 1831, and they're looking for John Delahunty of Clonmore, County Tipperary. So right now we have a town and a county. He arrived in America in 1818, so we can try to find a passenger list record for that, and boarded at the house of William Gleason in Boston at that time. His nephew has arrived and has something of importance to communicate to him. So any information, please contact William Gleason or Michael Delahunty. So now not only do we have John's name, but we have Michael's name. So it's kind of like a fan method where if you can't find the information on John, maybe we can look for Michael. But it does give us a lot of information just in this one advertisement that'll help us when we go to Ireland to look for records. You know, a lot of the Irish naturalized. Do try to find a nationalization record if you can't find a passenger list. A lot of Irish records were either lost or destroyed over the centuries. So what we're really needing is to understand the different jurisdictions in place in Ireland, which we'll go into next, and then where your ancestor lived. Like I said, we need a town or a parish. We need something to narrow down your search, because you will find a lot of Murphys, a lot of Kellys, and you're going to need to distinguish which one is your ancestor as opposed to someone else's. Religion will also be important. The Irish are very religious people. The vast majority of them are Roman Catholic, but there are some other denominations such as Quaker Methodists, Presbyterians, especially as you get up to the north. So let's talk about the jurisdictions, and we're going to start from the large and go down to the smallest. So if we start off with the provinces, there's 4 of them. So we have Ulster in the north, we have Leinster in the east, Munster in the south, and Connacht in the west. And within those 4 provinces, we're going to have counties, and that's where we're going to start to see a lot of information be administered by particular counties. But after that, we have the barony, the poor law union, the parishes, which are separated into civil and ecclesiastical, and then finally the townland, which will be the smallest unit. So here are the different counties in the 4 provinces, and you'll notice some have more than others. But if you can at least find the county they're from, that will at least narrow down your search significantly. But if we go back to Oni's, she was from the county of Tipperary, which is in the province of Munster. So we could narrow down searching for her if she was one of our ancestors by delving into records specifically for County Tipperary. Now, a word of clarification about the difference between Ulster and Northern Ireland. Back in the early 1920s, the Irish had a war of independence with the English. To resolve that conflict, a treaty was written up and signed by all participants, giving the counties in Ulster the option of either going with the new Irish Free State or to stay with the United Kingdom. 6 of those counties in Ulster decided to stay with the English, and the other 3 went with the Irish. So basically, Northern Ireland is a political designation. But because of the fact that a lot of those in Northern Ireland are Protestant and very loyal to the English, they will call, instead of, they want to distance themselves from using the word Ireland or Irish in any way, shape, or form, they may call those 6 counties Ulster. So when you're doing your research, be sure you understand whether or not that's a political designation or the actual province they're talking about. A lot of the Scots-Irish came from the political designation of Northern Ireland. So if you have Scots-Irish ancestors, that's probably where you're going to find a lot of the information for them. Then next we have the Poor Law Unions. These were created back in the early 1800s by the Poor Law Act. Before the Poor Law Act was enacted, the church was in charge of taking care of the poor. Once the government took over, then the government decided they needed to divide up each of the provinces and counties into districts in order to administer that relief. The map you see on the screen there is the divisions on the right of the Poor Law Unions for the province of Connacht. And you'll see they divided it up mainly by large towns. They're usually in each of those Poor Law Unions, there will be a large town in each of those. Later on, they decided they were going to divide it a little bit further and create dispensary districts where a doctor would be located to administer medications and such to the poor. The Poor Law Unions are going to become important later on when we talk about civil registration, because once the Poor Law Unions were no longer necessary, they used those same boundaries for what they called superintendent registration districts. And that's how they would separate each of the civil registration areas. So the Poor Law Union boundaries and the superintendent registration districts are both the same. They're just a different name. Then we had the old territorial divisions of barony. In the days when the baronies were of importance, they were there to describe real property valuation and ownership. And usually they were rewarded to somebody in favor to the English monarchs. They usually were a subdivision of a county. For example, this is the county of Roscommon, and you'll see that they have several baronies within that particular county. Some of the later 1800, early 1900 documents you may come across are organized by barony. For example, the old age pension claims, which were put into effect in the early 1900s, they're organized by barony and then the civil parish. So in order to find out if your particular ancestor had applied for an old age pension, you'd need to know first the barony, and then within that, you would need to know the civil parish that they belong to. So then we come to parishes. This is the basic unit for record keeping. You're going to find a lot of documents were first created in parishes. Some of them may still be in the parish. Some of them might be in the libraries or archives in the general area. They're divided up into two types. We have the civil parishes and we have the ecclesiastical parishes. A lot of the parishes were divided up, ignoring town or county boundaries. So some of them may extend further than a particular town's boundaries or may extend over a couple of counties. The civil parishes will have the same names and the boundaries as the Church of Ireland or the Anglican Church boundaries. So when you're looking for, if you have ancestors for their religion was Anglican, they're going to have the same names and the same boundaries as the civil parishes that you'll be looking for births, marriages, and deaths. Now, the Roman Catholic Church also has their own parishes, but they are not the same boundaries. The civil ones and the ecclesiastical ones for the Church of Ireland do have the same names. The Roman Catholic ones do not. They could have different names, they could have different boundaries, and through the centuries, some of them were expanded, some of them were removed, some of them changed. So just be aware that the boundaries for some of the Roman Catholic parishes may be different back when you're looking for records for your particular ancestor. And here's an example. So we're in County Waterford. On the left, you see all of the Roman Catholic parishes in the County of Waterford. On the right, you'll see all of the civil parishes, which would also be the Church of Ireland parishes for the same county. The example I like to use is if you look at the Catholic parishes, you have number 54 here on the west side. It actually encompasses 3 separate civil parishes. So you could have several of these Catholic parishes in one civil parish, or you might have several civil parishes in one Catholic parishes, depending on the size of the particular parishes. I'm going to mention him a couple of times during this presentation, but these came from John Grenham's website. John Grenham, in my opinion, is sort of like the Yoda, if we want to use a Star Wars reference, of Irish research. He has a 5th edition book that he has put out on tracing your Irish ancestors. He also has a website, johngrenham.com, which should be on one of your handouts. It's a good place to look for maps of the particular area so you can kind of get a sense of where everything is located. It also has a nice surname search, so you can look and see where your surname falls on the island. And then finally, we have the smallest unit, which is the townland, of which there's over 61,000 of them. They were usually named after a topographical or man-made feature like a river or a tree or a mountain range or something to that. Some of them were a few acres, some of them could have been thousands of acres. You will also find, as you do your research, that a lot of counties, towns, townlands have the same name. For example, Dublin is a town, but it's also a townland, and it's also a county. So just kind of, again, you need to be aware of what particular area they're discussing when you're looking at certain information on these particular areas. And here is an example. We have the county of Leitrim. and we have the differences between the Catholic parishes and the townlands. And notice too that these townlands do not stay within the county. If you look at the very top, you've got some townlands that are going above the county. And if you look down here, you've got some of the townlands going below the county. So let's say you know the townland that your ancestor came from. You might have to look in two different counties if it's organized by county and then townland to find that particular information. So just kind of be aware of the differences that you might find. All right, so the reason why Northern Ireland is as it is started out with the plantation of Ulster back in the 1600s. A lot of English monarchs tried to colonize Ireland with Scottish and English people. James I was the first one to do it successfully. So after the 9 Years' War, where the Irish chieftains had to flee Ireland, the English took over this area and they started divvying it up into different plantations. And they started giving that land to be settled by people such as lords and gentry from England and Scotland, veterans of the Irish War who were loyal to the English, London companies, Trinity College, as well as the church. The two major divisions were what they called undertakers and servitors. Undertakers would have been the lords and the gentry. They were required on their land to build a castle that was fortified, and they could only have as tenants English and Scottish. Now, the servitors were the veterans. They were the ones who were loyal to the crown, whether they be Irish, English, or Scottish. If they were given land, they were to build a house as opposed to a castle, but it had to be fortified as well, and they could have Irish tenants on their property. So this is where our Scots-Irish are coming from in the 1600s, and they settled in the north on these plantations, as they called them. And this was part of the early colonial period. Also during this period, besides the plantation and getting English and Scottish tenants into the north, the English also passed a lot of laws trying to get a lot of the Roman Catholic Irish to convert to the Church of Ireland. In order to do that, they established what they called penal laws. And there were several laws that were passed throughout many years. Some of the things that they were forbidden to do was to exercise their religion, so they couldn't have mass on Sunday. They couldn't keep church registers. So during this time period, you may or may not find Catholic registers for your particular location. They couldn't hold public office, they couldn't vote, they couldn't have land, and they couldn't receive an education. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that these things did happen. Some priests, even though it was under penalty of death, if they were caught keeping registers, some of them still did. And they might still be there at the parish, or they might now be online. It depends. But it's always a good idea to look just to be on the safe side. During this time period, like I said, a lot of census records didn't start till the 1800s. So what we're going to look at is census substitutes in a moment, but also look at deeds. Maybe you were your ancestors were one of the 2% of the population to buy land, or maybe they were mentioned in a deed of somebody else's. These began in the 1700s, so you might be able to find that. Memorials. There is a project going on that's constantly adding more and more things to their website for the Irish Genealogy Project. You might be able to find a headstone or a newspaper article on your particular ancestor. Again, and the Registry of Deeds project is also going on, trying to index all of the deeds so you can actually do a search by name of the information and see if your ancestor is on it. Maybe the landowner that your Irish ancestor paid rent to, mentioned them in either somewhere in the state papers. A lot of times the landowner will mention their tenants, like this is how much I'm getting from this particular tenant for this amount of land. Or so-and-so holding crops of this amount for shipment to England. So, state papers would be something else you might want to look at. Some of them are online. Some of them you might have to go to an archive. Some of the larger landowners probably have a private archive that you might have to write to them directly and request information. But it is possible to do that. Passenger lists. Let's talk passenger lists. Ancestry does have the William Philby Passenger and Immigration Index on their individual subscription. They don't have that on the library edition, but we have the books. They're also available too to look at. Maybe you need to find, like we did with One Fitzmaurice, a particular passenger list that lists at least the county they're from. You'll notice passenger lists changed over the time depending on the information that the government wanted, and they got larger and larger. By the early 1900s, they were 2 pages, and not only did they list the town they were from, but the name of a person who was still living in that town. Some of the census substitutes you can use. The Irish have done a lot of land surveys over the centuries. Those might be the first place you might want to look for records because they will list tenants on there. And we mentioned the registry of deeds. Perhaps your Irish ancestor was in the military, either on the side of the Irish or on the side of the English. If they were on the side of the Irish, you might go to their military website to check to see if you can find a muster roll for them. If they were on the English side, you'd go to the National Archives of the UK to find out what information you could find. Everybody was taxed. Taxation records are available as well. We've mentioned church records. Maybe the landowner or your ancestor himself had a court case going on. Maybe they were mentioned in a deposition. It's always important to look just like you did when you did your research in the US. Look for every particular type of record you can. And we did mention the estate records. The National Archives of Ireland has an overview of estate records. The Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, which would be in that particular Northern Ireland area, has paper collections, which you might be able to read their guide and see what they have, and maybe that you can contact them to see if there's a particular item that you're interested in. So now let's talk about church records. Nowadays, you can go to irishgenealogy.ie, which is also listed on your handout. They have not only church records, Roman Catholic church records on their website you can search, but they also have a lot of the civil registration records. And you go to their website, their first page, it just says search the record. You can start putting in names and information that you do know and see what pulls up, or they also have guides that'll help you. They've also got links to other locations that will help you find records that you might be looking for. The National Library of Ireland also has most of the Catholic parishes. They've digitized their microfilm, so you can look at that. Find My Past has indexes, so does Ancestry, up to 1900. Family Search also has a lot of the parish records as well that you can search. And the Irish Family History Foundation, which is called Roots Ireland, does have some records for all of the 32 counties. Of course, some of these, such as Roots Ireland, may charge a fee. But for the most part, a lot of the stuff on here, especially if you're going to places like irishgenealogy.ie or Family Search, are free to use. Now, the Church of Ireland registers obviously start earlier than the Roman Catholic because of the penal laws. They weren't allowed to keep registers. But you can find probably on the Church of Ireland records as early as 1634, keeping records of christening and burials. though the majority of them start in the late 1700s. Now, for burials, you might just get a name and the date they were buried. You may not get a date of death on those records, but it doesn't hurt to check. Original indexes are available at the National Archives. The National Archive of Ireland, however, does have transcripts and images, so does Find My Past and Family Search. Now, the National Library of Ireland has got a nice little webpage called the Genealogical Office, where you can go to and you can look at abstracts, you can look at their digital collections that they have. One of the requirements of marriages is you needed to have a marriage ban, which meant you put up an announcement for 3 weeks before you were actually able to get married. It gave people time to decide whether or not there was a reason these people could not be joined in matrimony. If you wanted to skip that process, you could pay a bond and just go ahead and get married. And that's what those prerogative marriage license bonds are. So if you think your ancestor had the money, which is usually, these were usually reserved for the middle and upper class, but you can always check to see if maybe your ancestor had enough money to skip the 3-week marriage bans and go directly to just getting married. Some other places for church records. I've mentioned Irish Genealogy. That is a free site. Family History Foundation is subscription-based. Ancestry and Find My Past, obviously they're subscription-based. Unless you go to a library that has a copy of those, you can sit down and search those for free. Family Search. The Ulster History Foundation, which primarily has Northern Ireland-related information, though they do have some for the South. It is a paid site, but they do have a lot of different information that you can view for free as well. And then if you're looking for transcribed records, they're out there in abundance in a lot of different places. So then when we get to the late colonial period, we come across the 5 waves of migration. And this was put into place simply because once again, we've got penal laws to try to convert the Roman Catholic Irish. We've got the Ulster Plantation trying to input a lot of English and Scottish into the area. Well, the third way that the English decided, well, if we can't get them to convert and we, can't get them off the land, let's give them reasons to immigrate. So we have 5 waves during this time period, and you'll notice that drought was a major factor, famine was a major factor, religious persecution was also one. But if you look at the 4th wave, effective propaganda, a lot of the English ships that sailed back and forth lowered their fares so the Irish could afford to immigrate. And it was quite effective because during this late time period, a lot of English, a lot of the Irish, not only the Irish in the South, but also a lot of the Scots-Irish in the North immigrated during this time period. But they also had a lot of what they called rack renting, where they would keep raising the price of the rent until the Irish family couldn't afford, and then they would be evicted. Whether it be the landlord wanted somebody else who was willing to pay more on that land, or they were just trying to get rid of this particular group of people, they would raise the rents. But you will find a lot of information on these particular migration waves in a lot of different history books. County histories, if you look at U.S. county histories, a lot of the Irish who maybe founded a town or some of the first settlers in a town, they will explain, yes, they came over in this time period, might have been before the U.S. government required passenger lists, and they settled in this area. They were from this county or this town. Drought caused their crops to fail, so they decided to immigrate for a better life. This is why it's really important to look at a lot of the U.S. records and see what you can find. Now, because of the fact that a lot of the Scots-Irish who were originally Presbyterian in Scotland, you're going to see a lot of books about around this time period on the Presbyterian Church. And I've listed a couple of them here. Census substitutes is another thing, because again, we don't have census records for Ireland at this particular stage. And the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland would be the place to go for your Scots-Irish. Now, if we talk about before the Great Famine, this is the pre-famine years. At this point, they haven't increased their plantations, so we still just have Northern Ireland with the English and the Scottish. But the penal laws weren't working. A lot of the Irish Catholics stayed Irish Catholic. So the English decided, well, we're going to give up that particular ploy, and they started repealing a lot of those penal laws during this time period. So they were able to start becoming members of Parliament again. They were able to vote again. They were able to conduct educations again, keeping track of birth, marriage, and death registers again. They also found out that their lowering of prices was letting a lot of the Irish immigrate, and they were running low on Irish, which is kind of unusual. But they decided that somebody needed to farm the land, and the Irish were the best ones to farm the land. So they decided to raise the prices on the ships, and naturally immigration went down because most of them couldn't afford to leave. This is also the time period of poor law unions when the government took over the relief for the poor, as little as there was. Ireland has been for a long period of time a very poor country in these particular time periods in the 16, 17, and 1800s. But the government took over that for the church. So you will start to see a lot more Catholic registers. So if your ancestors are Roman Catholic, check Family Search, check the Irish Genealogy website, Find My Past and Roots Ireland. Not only for Catholic, but maybe your ancestors were Anglican. You can always check that for them as well. Tax records, always at the usual suspects. The tithe allotment books will give you the list of townland occupants. They'll give you the head of the household as opposed to the entire family, but they will tell you the families who were living in the townland at the time. You can check poor law, union, or workhouse records. Maybe your ancestor was in the workhouse for a while. You can check those on Ancestry, the National Archives, Family Search, and Find My Past, as well as census substitutes, which we will talk about. But let's mention the workhouse records first. Even though there's no comprehensive guide that'll tell you, okay, this is the workhouse, this is where the records are, because a lot of them are online. You will find out that during this time period, shortly before and during the Great Famine, these workhouses quickly filled up. A lot of them, because Liverpool was a major port nearby in England, a lot of them went to Liverpool to try to find a job if they couldn't find a job. Even the English had workhouses, okay? So they may have gone to the workhouse in England. If that's the case, you're going to look at the National Archives of England to find those workhouse records. Sometimes they were sent to maybe another town. Maybe they were sent to Manchester and they worked there for 6 months. And then they got their ticket to America paid for. Because this time period, there was a lot of poor out there. And when the workhouses filled up, they couldn't allow anybody else in. So you might even have some of the poor camping outside the workhouse. And again, these are the ones that became superintendent registration districts for civil registration when it started in the 1800s. So Irish census records started in 1821. But from 1821 to 1891, most of those were destroyed for one reason or another. What's left of the first few, the 1821 to 1851, you can find on the National Archives website of Ireland. You can find them on Find My Past and Family Search. The only complete censuses that the Irish have is the 1901 and 1911. Those are still completely intact and you can search those. England, Scotland, Wales, as well as Ireland always did their censuses every 10 years on the 1. So if they hadn't had an Irish Civil War during 1921, there would have been a 1921 census. But because of the fact that they were having their Civil War during that time period, the next census won't be until 1926, which will be available in 2027. But as you can see, here's an example of a 1911 page from a census record. It's pretty similar to the US ones. And it does list all the members of the household for 1901 and 1911. And they are, even if you have ancestors that came over before this time period, the 1901 and 1911 are fairly good because not everybody immigrated. Some of whole families did, but a lot of them stayed. Some of the older Irish or some of the younger ones who decided they didn't want to take the chance of going across the Atlantic decided to stay. You might be able to find them in these records. And if you know their names, if you've done your FAN method, like family, associates, and neighbors, and trace them backwards, you might be able to pick up some more clues from these particular census records. So we reached the famine. So this is from 1845 to 1851. This is when the majority of Southern Irish immigrated, and probably a lot of your ancestors as well. One of the things that they did do during this time period is they did start to lower the cost because of the fact that the government was very heavily trying to keep track of the poor and help them as much as they could. A lot of them did immigrate because there just wasn't enough to go around. So the cheaper fares would be on the English ships, and they would go to Canada first, and then from Canada, the immigrant could cross the border over into the United States. However, the difference between the English ships and the American ships were that the English ships weren't as well built as the American ships, and they took a lot longer. So a 2-week trip on an American ship might have taken a month or more on an English ship. And if they're going to Canada first, and then you had to cross the border over into America, that took a little bit longer. A lot of times you will find that a lot of these ships, at least 30% of the passengers, depending on if it was a month or 2 months, died on the voyage over. And a lot of times they would land in Quebec or Ontario or those particular areas. There's still a lot of Irish in Canada in these particular areas. But they called them coffin ships, these English ships that came over to Canada first. There is a National Historical Site there. The Library and Archives of Canada has information on those Irish immigrants who came over and then may have crossed the border into the US. So if you suspect Canadian Irish that came over to the US, you might want to check with the Library and Archives of Canada first. You might also want to check too, if they came in through New York, you might want to check the New York passenger lists. There's also a couple of New York Immigrant Savings Bank and other locations that were specifically designed to help a particular ethnic group. In this particular instance, this Immigrant Savings Bank was for the Irish. So for example, maybe one of the daughters would come over and work as a maid or a housekeeper. She would save up her money, put it in the bank, and then when they had saved up enough, she would send that money home to Ireland. And there would be a record of that on the bank information. And one of the family members would receive that information in Ireland. Maybe they were saving up to bring the rest of the family over. Maybe they were saving just for one person, but you could still take a look at the information on that. Ancestry does have that information, so do feel free to take a look at that and see if maybe if your ancestor landed in New York first, if they might have had an account there at the Immigrant Savings Bank. IrishFamilyEviction.com is a project like the Deeds Project, like the Memorials Project, that is keeping track of the evictions that went on during this time period. So if you think that your ancestors might have been evicted, but even if you're not sure, I would check there just to see what they have. And all of these projects are totally ongoing. They're going to keep adding more and more records to it as they find them. NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration here in the US, has a lot of information on passenger lists. It will give you the details of when the government started requiring passenger lists, what they wanted on the passenger lists, and how they changed over time. But you can actually find the actual passenger lists on Ancestry, Find My Past, and Family Search for the Irish. Again, we're talking church records, either here in the US or some of the Irish related records you'll find on Find My Past and Family Search. We've talked about the title allotments again. That's another one you can go to, Griffin's Valuation. For some bizarre reason, the English, the Scottish, and the Welsh, as well as the Irish, did a lot of land surveys. They wanted to keep track of who owned what, how much tax they needed to pay, etc. So Griffin's Valuation is a good place to start when you get over there to see where your ancestors might have been located. Again, they're only going to list the head of the household, but it will be something that you can work with. Ask About Ireland also has a copy. Griffin's you can find pretty much in all the major databases, as well as some smaller ones as well. It's a good one to take a look at. Now let's Superintendent Register Districts for civil registration. Okay, civil registration started a little bit earlier for the Church of Ireland. Their marriages began in 1845, but everybody else started in 1864 for birth, marriage, and deaths. Again, those registration districts were set up by the existing poor law unions. And you can find more information on how that all was set up on Roots Ireland. The Northern Ireland information is on PRONI, the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. Family Search and Land Ancestry have indexes for the civil records. If for some instance you cannot find it online, you can always contact the registrar's office in that district for information. For the birth records will list only the date that the birth was registered with the registrar's office, not the actual birth date, because they had a good time period, several days before they had to bring the child and register the child's birth. But one of the nice things about it is it does list the parents' names on the registration, as well as the mother's maiden name. So that's always nice. Father's names will be listed on marriage records. So if you find a marriage record, you'll at least get the father's name, that you can go back another generation. Here's an example of a birth record from 1864. And again, a lot of the digitized images may not be perfect. But if you look at this one here at the top of the page, it just shows you the registration district name. It shows you the county name, all that information. And then it will give you the name of the child's name, what sex the child is, the father's name, and where he's located. So the town he's from. Then it will give the mother's name with her maiden name, what the father does as an occupation, who the informant was, and 9 times out of 10 it'll be the father who comes in to register the child, and then the date of registration and the signature. So, for example, in this one down here that I've highlighted, Margaret is the daughter who was born. Her surname is Drudy, and the mother's maiden name was Riley. So you have information about both sides of the family. Again, if you're looking for information, check Griffin's first. Because not only did they do evaluation, but they also did revision books after the famine through the early part of the 20th century. Civil registration is another one of your best bets during this time period, as well as the 1901 and 1911 census. Roman Catholic Church records, most of them didn't start till the middle of the 1800s, but you might find some earlier than that, since the penal laws were being repealed rather quickly over the late 1700s. And again, we mentioned the Registry of Deeds and the Will and Testamentary records. And again, check the major genealogy databases for information. So why was most of the Irish censuses lost? Well, right after the Irish War of Independence in the early 20th century, they created a treaty, and the treaty, as I mentioned when we talked about Northern Ireland, gave the North the option. Well, a lot of the Southern Irish didn't like that. They wanted Ireland to be one whole republic as opposed to divided up into North and South. So the Irish Civil War started pretty much because of that treaty. And the anti-treaty forces took over what they called the Four Courts building, which housed the Public Record Office, as well as the courts. They loaded ammunition in the building, and the English told the provisional Irish government that we need to stop the Civil War, or we're going to come back in and stop it for you. Well, Michael Collins, who was head of the provisionary government at the time, he decided he did not want the English back. So cannons were fired on the building. Fire started because the ammunition in the building blew up. Documents went everywhere. After the Civil War ended, you can see pictures online of people actually going through the rubble, trying to salvage what fragments we have now. And which you can take a look at if it's in the area of where your ancestors came from. Most of the wills were destroyed in the fires, but the indexes do survive. A lot of the Church of Ireland registers were destroyed. Fortunately, they were required, the parishes were required to keep a second copy. So a lot of those can be found in the parish area as well. The good part is if your ancestors were Roman Catholic, they didn't store those here. So they were not destroyed in the Four Courts bombing. So before we get, I wanted to come up here. This is our information in case you have any questions. The email address here on this page is our query service in case you are interested in asking a question. If you can't remember the question today, feel free to contact us. I'm looking for this particular document. Where would I look? Or do you know of where I could find this particular document? And if we actually find the document, we'll be more than happy to send it to you. We have our phone number here and our address. We are on Facebook. We are on Twitter, formerly known as Twitter, X, formerly known as Twitter, and on YouTube as well. But I wanted to show you a couple of those websites real quick. So let me, or we ask, this is irishgenealogy.ie. Okay, you see, you go to it right there at the beginning, search online records. You can click on civil records or church records, put in what information you know, what event type you're looking for, and do a search. But they also have information on those records and what you might find in them. They also have information on the genealogical research, how to approach it in Ireland, Irish places and names, and how that might affect your searches, etc. Another website that you might want to take a look at is John Grenham's website. This is his main page for Irish ancestors. And see, there's only one thing on there, search for a surname. So you can type a surname in and it only gives you 2 or 3 options before it asks you to subscribe, but you can still type in a search name and see where that particular name lands. Let's see if it'll let me do it today. There we go. Okay, so if you type in the surname Bailey, for example, here's the map, and it shows you where that name located on the island, and you'll notice the vast majority of them are up in the north because Bailey is a Scots-Irish name. And the blue means there's more concentration of that surname in that particular area than the green. But one of the nice things about Grenham's site is that not only does it allow you to see where that surname is located, it gives you maps that you might need, the variant of the surname spelling that you might find throughout history, as well as it separates down the number of that surname in a particular location. The surname dictionary they also have, as well as if there's any website with that name, he will list that here as well. So it's a really nice website to kind of get an idea of, if you have absolutely no clue about where your ancestor came from, you can look on this. Now, granted, if it's a name like Murphy, which is the most popular name in Ireland, it might be everywhere, but you can still see the blue dots, which is where a vast majority of the surname is located. And one more thing, before we open it up for questions. This is the virtual treasury.ie. This is a recreation of what the Public Record Office looked like before it got blown up. And you can do a virtual tour of it. You can go into the records vault and see what records they have recovered, what records, this is an ongoing project, what records they are still looking for. And they'll give you information on, if they do not have that record recreated, they will give you information on where you might look for it. But it's a really nice look at, if you can't be there in person, what is actually there in the particular treasury. And I want to thank everybody for spending part of their St. Patrick's Day with us today. And we hope you have a great rest of your day. And thank you so much. Thank you.